The mists of time shroud many truths about Tamriel's greatest hero, yet none spark such fierce debate as the figure known as Talos. Was he mortal man who achieved divinity through conquest and will, or divine essence that descended to reshape the world through mortal flesh? The answer lies buried beneath layers of imperial propaganda, Nordic legend, and theological revision that have transformed a complex historical figure into something both more and less than the truth. To understand Talos, we must first acknowledge that we speak not of one being, but of three distinct yet intertwined entities whose fates became so entangled that separating their individual contributions requires careful examination of sources that often contradict themselves with stunning audacity. The conventional imperial narrative presents a sanitized version of events, while Nordic oral traditions preserve fragments of older truths that paint a far more complex picture of ascension, betrayal, and transformation. The earliest threads of this tapestry begin in the province of Atmora during the late Merethic era, when the northern continent still harbored scattered settlements of hardy Nords who had not yet joined the great migrations to Tamriel. Among these final holdouts lived a young warrior whose birth name has been lost to history, though Nordic tradition suggests he bore the title Ismir even before his legendary deeds began. This figure, who would later become known as Tiber Septim, emerged from obscurity during a period when Atmora itself was dying, its ancient magic failing, and its people facing extinction in the growing cold. The journey from forgotten Atmoran warrior to Emperor of Tamriel required more than martial prowess or political cunning, though Tiber Septim possessed both in abundance. The transformation demanded something far more fundamental, a willingness to sacrifice not merely comfort or safety, but identity itself in service of a vision that transcended personal ambition. The man who would become Talos understood instinctively that true power required not the conquest of enemies, but the conquest of impossibility itself. Nordic accounts describe the young warrior's arrival in Skyrim as unremarkable, one more refugee among thousands fleeing Atmora's final collapse. Yet within a single generation, this anonymous figure had begun attracting followers through demonstrations of tactical brilliance that bordered on prescience. His early campaigns against the fragmented holds of Skyrim revealed an understanding of warfare that seemed to transcend conventional military thinking, as if he perceived patterns in conflict that remained invisible to his contemporaries. The political landscape of late Second Era Tamriel provided the perfect crucible for such ambitions. The interregnum had shattered the continent into competing factions, each claiming legitimate authority while lacking the strength to impose unified rule. The Three Banners War had exhausted the great powers, leaving smaller kingdoms and city-states to fill the resulting vacuum through constantly shifting alliances that benefited no one save the merchants who profited from perpetual conflict. Into this chaos stepped a figure who offered something that had been absent from Tamrielic politics for centuries: genuine vision beyond immediate gain. Where other warlords sought to carve out territories for personal enrichment, Tiber Septim spoke of unification not as conquest, but as restoration. His rhetoric drew upon deep currents of Nordic mythology, particularly the ancient belief that Skyrim's destiny involved not merely survival, but the renewal of imperial glory that had been lost with the fall of the Alessian Empire. The early battles that established Tiber Septim's reputation demonstrated tactical innovations that military historians still study with fascination and bewilderment. His forces moved with coordination that suggested supernatural communication, striking at precisely the moments when enemy formations were most vulnerable to specific types of assault. Captured enemy commanders reported feeling as though their strategies had been anticipated before they were even formulated, leading to rumors that the young general possessed prophetic abilities. More intriguing than his military successes were the alliances Tiber Septim forged with forces that conventional wisdom deemed irreconcilable. Nordic berserkers fought alongside Breton battle mages, while Redguard sword saints coordinated attacks with Imperial legionnaires who had previously served different masters. This unprecedented cooperation suggested leadership qualities that transcended mere charisma, hinting at deeper understanding of the psychological and cultural forces that motivated different peoples. The siege of Sancre marked the first clear indication that Tiber Septim's ambitions extended beyond conventional conquest. This ancient fortress, sacred to Nordic tradition as the burial place of kings, had remained unconquered throughout the interregnum, despite multiple attempts by various claimants to imperial authority. The site's metaphysical significance as a nexus of Nordic spiritual power made its capture symbolically crucial for anyone seeking to unite Skyrim under single rule. Yet Tiber Septim's approach to Sancre differed dramatically from previous sieges. Rather than employing conventional tactics of bombardment and assault, his forces conducted what can only be described as a ritual conquest, with specific ceremonies performed at calculated intervals during the encirclement. Nordic shamans within his army carried out rites that had not been seen since the earliest days of Nordic settlement in Tamriel, suggesting access to religious knowledge that had been preserved in secret traditions. The fall of Sancre unleashed forces that fundamentally altered the nature of Tiber Septim's campaign. Witnesses described strange phenomena during the final assault: enemy arrows changing direction mid-flight, siege engines operating without crews, and defenders abandoning positions without apparent cause. These reports, while dismissed by imperial historians as battlefield exaggeration, aligned too consistently across multiple sources to be entirely fabricated. More significantly, the conquest of Sancre provided Tiber Septim with access to artifacts and knowledge that had been hidden within the fortress for centuries. Nordic tradition speaks of ancient weapons stored beneath the keep, blades forged during the earliest days of Nordic kingship and imbued with powers that reflected the spiritual authority of their wielders. The acquisition of these relics marked a transformation in how Tiber Septim presented himself to his followers, shifting from successful warlord to divinely chosen champion. The theological implications of this transformation cannot be understated. Nordic religion had always maintained complex relationships with concepts of divine kingship, recognizing that exceptional individuals could serve as conduits for godlike power without necessarily becoming gods themselves. The tradition of Ysmir, the Nordic aspect of Talos, provided precedent for mortals who achieved such extraordinary status that they transcended normal human limitations while remaining fundamentally mortal in nature. Tiber Septim's adoption of increasingly divine symbolism coincided with military victories that defied conventional explanation. His armies began achieving objectives that should have been impossible given their size and resources, conquering territories that had resisted previous conquerors for generations. The speed of these conquests suggested coordination and intelligence that exceeded normal human capabilities, fueling speculation about the true nature of his authority. The integration of diverse peoples under Tiber Septim's banner created cultural exchanges that produced lasting changes in Tamrielic civilization. Nordic military traditions merged with imperial organizational methods, while Breton magical techniques enhanced Redguard martial disciplines in combinations that had never been attempted before. These synergistic developments demonstrated how unity could produce capabilities that exceeded the sum of individual cultural contributions. Yet beneath these remarkable achievements lay tensions that would ultimately shape the complex legacy of Talos. The transformation from mortal conqueror to divine emperor required sacrifices that extended beyond the physical realm into fundamental questions of identity and purpose. The man who had begun as a simple Atmaran warrior was becoming something unprecedented in Tamrielic history, a figure whose very existence challenged conventional understanding of the boundaries between mortal and divine. The political mechanics of this transformation involved careful manipulation of existing religious and cultural frameworks throughout the territories under Tiber Septim's control. Rather than imposing Nordic traditions upon conquered peoples, His administration developed sophisticated methods for incorporating local beliefs into broader imperial ideology. This inclusive approach prevented the religious conflicts that had plagued previous attempts at continental unification, while creating new forms of cultural synthesis. The economic foundations supporting these rapid conquests reveal another dimension of Tiber Septim's extraordinary capabilities. His forces operated with supply lines that functioned more efficiently than those of established kingdoms, despite covering vast distances across hostile territory. Trade networks emerged in the wake of his armies, creating prosperity that made his rule preferable to previous arrangements, even among populations that had initially resisted conquest. The administrative systems established in newly conquered territories demonstrated organizational sophistication that seemed to anticipate problems before they developed. Local governors appointed by Tiber Septim displayed remarkable consistency in their approaches to regional challenges, suggesting coordination through methods that transcended normal communication limitations. These patterns hint at capabilities that extended beyond conventional political and military leadership into realms that conventional analysis struggles to explain. As Tiber Septim's influence expanded across Tamriel, the very nature of his identity began shifting in ways that would prove crucial for understanding the eventual emergence of Talos as divine entity. The boundaries between the historical figure and the mythological construct started blurring as his achievements took on proportions that exceeded normal human possibility, creating space for theological interpretations that would eventually transform remembrance into worship. The ascension from extraordinary mortal to something approaching divinity required more than individual will or military genius. It demanded the convergence of forces that existed beyond the material realm, drawing upon currents of power that flowed through Tamriel's spiritual landscape like hidden rivers beneath the surface of conventional reality. The figure who would become Talos understood intuitively that true transformation required alignment with these deeper patterns, positioning himself not merely as conqueror, but as conduit for energies that sought expression through mortal agency. The theological complexities surrounding this transformation reveal themselves most clearly when examining the role of the second figure whose essence would eventually merge with that of Tiber Septim. Zurin Arctus, the imperial battle mage whose magical prowess rivaled that of the ancient Dwemer, brought to their alliance capabilities that complemented and amplified the Nordic warrior's natural gifts. Where Tiber Septim possessed the charisma and tactical brilliance necessary for conquest, Arctus commanded knowledge of metaphysical principles that could transform temporary victories into permanent transformations of reality itself. The partnership between these two extraordinary individuals created synergies that neither could have achieved alone. Arctus understood the theoretical frameworks underlying divine ascension, while Tiber Septim possessed the raw force of will necessary to implement such transformations despite their inherent dangers. Together, they began exploring possibilities that had been considered purely theoretical since the disappearance of the Dwemer, investigating methods for transcending the normal limitations that constrained mortal consciousness. The magical research conducted during this period remained highly classified even within imperial archives, with most documents either destroyed or hidden in collections accessible only to the highest levels of the Elder Council. Surviving fragments suggest experiments that pushed the boundaries of conventional enchantment and soul manipulation, exploring techniques that bordered on what later scholars would classify as metaphysical engineering. These investigations required resources that exceeded anything available to previous magical researchers, drawing upon the wealth and authority of an emerging empire to fund explorations into realms of knowledge that had been forbidden or forgotten. The creation of the Numidium represents the most visible manifestation of this collaboration between martial conquest and magical innovation. This colossal automaton, constructed using principles derived from Dwemer technology but enhanced through imperial magical theory, embodied capabilities that transcended anything seen since the disappearance of the Deep Ones. The brass god, as it came to be known, possessed the power to reshape reality through what can only be described as localized time breaks. creating zones where cause and effect operated according to different rules than those governing normal existence. The metaphysical implications of the Numidium's operation extended far beyond its immediate military applications. Each activation of the construct created ripples in the fabric of reality that propagated outward from its location, subtly altering the fundamental properties of space and time throughout ever-widening areas of influence. These changes, while imperceptible to most observers, created conditions that made previously impossible achievements suddenly attainable, as if the very universe was being gradually restructured to accommodate new forms of existence. The psychological toll of working with such forces became evident in the relationship between Tiber Septim and Zurin Arctus as their experiments progressed. The constant exposure to energies that operated outside normal metaphysical constraints began affecting both men in ways that transcended simple magical corruption. They started exhibiting characteristics that suggested their individual identities were becoming fluid, with observers reporting conversations where it became unclear which man was speaking, or whether they were somehow communicating through means that bypassed conventional speech entirely. The strategic applications of these metaphysical discoveries transformed the nature of imperial expansion from simple conquest to something approaching cosmic engineering. Territories that submitted to imperial authority found themselves gradually integrated into a network of influence that operated through channels invisible to conventional observation. Trade routes functioned with supernatural efficiency. Communication systems operated faster than physical travel should have allowed, and administrative decisions demonstrated prescience that suggested access to information about future events. The resistance movements that arose in response to imperial expansion faced challenges that exceeded normal military opposition. Their supply lines would fail inexplicably, their leaders would make strategic errors that seemed completely out of character, and their popular support would erode through processes that appeared natural but followed patterns too consistent to be entirely coincidental. These effects suggested that imperial influence was operating through mechanisms that targeted the fundamental structures supporting organized opposition, rather than merely overwhelming it through superior force. The cultural transformations accompanying imperial expansion revealed another dimension of the forces being deployed. Conquered populations began adopting imperial customs and beliefs with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the benefits offered by political submission. Local religious traditions evolved to incorporate imperial theological concepts, while traditional art forms started reflecting themes and symbols that had originated in distant provinces. These changes occurred too rapidly and too consistently to result from normal cultural exchange, suggesting influence through channels that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The emergence of the third component of what would become the Talos Oversoul occurred during this period of unprecedented expansion and transformation. Ysmir Wulfharth, the ancient Nordic king whose spirit had persisted through centuries of undeath, represented forces that predated the current imperial project, while sharing its fundamental orientation toward transcendence of normal limitations. His incorporation into the growing confluence of identities brought elements of temporal continuity that connected the emerging divine entity to the deepest currents of Nordic spiritual tradition. The mechanics of this spiritual merger challenge conventional understanding of individual identity and consciousness. Rather than simple possession or replacement, the process appeared to involve the gradual harmonization of distinct but compatible essences, each contributing specific capabilities while maintaining enough coherence to function as unified will. The result transcended the normal boundaries between self and other, creating something that was simultaneously one and three, individual and collective, mortal and divine. The manifestation of this unified consciousness through the physical form of Tiber Septim created paradoxes that observers struggled to comprehend. The emperor displayed knowledge of events that had occurred before his birth, demonstrated capabilities that exceeded any single individual's training, and spoke with authority that seemed to draw upon sources of wisdom that transcended personal experience. These anomalies were initially dismissed as political theatre designed to enhance imperial prestige, but their consistency and depth suggested genuine transformation rather than mere performance. The theological implications of this transformation extended throughout the religious landscape of Tamriel, as various traditions attempted to accommodate the emergence of what appeared to be a genuinely divine presence operating through mortal agency. Nordic shamans recognized patterns that aligned with their most ancient prophecies regarding the return of Ysmir, while imperial priests identified fulfillments of obscure doctrinal predictions regarding divine incarnation. Even elven theological traditions, despite their general hostility toward human spiritual claims, acknowledged the unprecedented nature of what was occurring. The administrative consequences of governing an empire through divine consciousness created challenges that had never been faced by previous rulers. Decision-making processes that had once required extensive consultation and deliberation could now be completed through methods that appeared instantaneous, but actually involved forms of temporal manipulation that compressed extended analysis into moments of apparent intuition. The efficiency gains were remarkable, but they came at the cost of conventional understanding regarding the boundaries between present and future knowledge. The economic effects of divine administration transformed imperial prosperity in ways that defied conventional analysis. Trade agreements negotiated by imperial representatives consistently favored imperial interests to degrees that suggested foreknowledge of market conditions that would not become apparent for months or years. Resource allocation decisions demonstrated understanding of supply and demand fluctuations that exceeded the capabilities of even the most sophisticated merchant networks, creating abundance that seemed to emerge from careful manipulation of probability rather than simple productive efficiency. The military applications of divine consciousness proved even more transformative than the political and economic benefits. Imperial forces began operating with coordination that transcended normal command structures, responding to threats before they fully materialized and exploiting enemy weaknesses that had not yet become apparent to conventional observation. Battle plans developed through divine insight consistently achieved objectives that should have required larger forces or more favorable circumstances, suggesting that reality itself was being subtly influenced to support imperial success. The personal cost of sustaining divine consciousness through mortal form became increasingly apparent as the transformation progressed. Tiber Septim's physical appearance began showing signs of strain that went beyond normal aging, with observers noting changes that suggested his body was struggling to contain energies that exceeded its natural capacity. The Emperor's behavior also displayed increasing detachment from conventional human concerns, as if his consciousness was gradually shifting toward perspectives that encompass broader temporal and spatial scales than normal mortal awareness could sustain. The metaphysical architecture supporting this unprecedented merger of mortal and divine required constant maintenance through rituals and practices that remained hidden from public observation. Imperial ceremonies that appeared to be simple state functions actually served as focal points for energies that sustain the complex spiritual equilibrium necessary for continued divine manifestation. The seemingly routine activities of court life concealed sophisticated magical workings that drew upon resources from across the empire to maintain the delicate balance between transcendence and incarnation. The approaching culmination of this extraordinary transformation would test the limits of what mortal reality could accommodate, setting the stage for events that would forever alter the relationship between divine and mortal realms throughout Tamriel. The convergence of these three essences within a single mortal frame created resonances that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of Tiber Septim's empire, touching realms of existence that most scholars could barely comprehend. The process was not merely spiritual transformation, but fundamental restructuring of reality's basic architecture. as if the universe itself was being rewritten to accommodate a new category of existence that transcended conventional distinctions between mortal and divine consciousness. The strain of maintaining this unprecedented unity manifested in ways that challenged every witness to reconsider their understanding of identity, power, and the nature of divinity itself. Court observers noted that conversations with the Emperor often felt like speaking with multiple individuals simultaneously, each response containing layers of perspective that seemed to emerge from distinct but harmoniously aligned sources of knowledge and experience. Zurin Arctus, whose magical expertise had made much of this transformation possible, began experiencing the psychological consequences of sustained exposure to forces that operated beyond normal metaphysical boundaries. His journals from this period, preserved in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Library, reveal a mind struggling to maintain coherence while processing information that came from sources existing outside conventional temporal flow. The battle mage's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as he documented phenomena that his training had never prepared him to encounter. The most disturbing entries describe experiences during which Arctus felt his individual consciousness dissolving into something vast and impersonal, as if his identity was being gradually absorbed into a larger pattern that encompassed not merely the present moment, but all possible futures and pasts simultaneously. These episodes left him with knowledge he could not remember acquiring, and capabilities he could not explain through reference to his formal magical education. The relationship between the Emperor and his chief advisor grew increasingly complex, as both men found themselves changing in ways that transcended normal human development. Their conversations took on qualities that suggested communication through channels that bypassed conventional speech, with observers reporting exchanges where crucial information seemed to pass between them without words being spoken. The boundary between their individual identities became so fluid that courtiers sometimes could not determine which man had initiated particular policies or decisions. The Numidium's continued operation during this period created cascading effects throughout the metaphysical substrate underlying Tamrielic reality. Each activation of the brass god sent ripples through the fabric of existence that accumulated over time, gradually altering the fundamental constants that governed magical and physical laws throughout the continent. These changes were subtle enough to escape notice by most observers, but profound enough to create new possibilities for consciousness, expansion, and reality manipulation. The ancient Nordic prophecies preserved in the deepest oral traditions spoke of a time when the barriers between different modes of existence would thin sufficiently to allow unprecedented forms of being to emerge. The current transformation appeared to fulfill these predictions in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic interpretations, creating conditions where mortal consciousness could sustain divine awareness without being immediately destroyed by the attempt. Ysmir Wulfharth's contribution to this emerging unity brought elements of temporal continuity that connected the present transformation to the deepest currents of Nordic spiritual tradition. His undead existence had preserved memories and capabilities that spanned centuries, providing access to knowledge and techniques that had been lost to normal historical transmission. The ancient king's perspective encompassed cycles of rise and decline that offered crucial insights into the long-term sustainability of divine incarnation. The merger of these three distinct but compatible essences created paradoxes that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and identity. Rather than simple combination or replacement, the process involved the emergence of something entirely new that retained characteristics of its component elements while transcending the limitations that had constrained each individual consciousness. The result was simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizable and utterly unprecedented. The theological implications of this transformation reverberated throughout every religious tradition in Tamriel as scholars and priests attempted to categorize what they were witnessing. Traditional frameworks for understanding divinity proved inadequate for describing an entity that maintained mortal form while displaying capabilities that exceeded those of established gods. The emergence of Talos represented not merely another addition to existing pantheons, but a fundamental challenge to prevailing cosmological models. Nordic shamans recognized patterns in the transformation that aligned with their most sacred prophecies regarding the return of Ysmir in times of greatest need. Their oral traditions spoke of a figure who would unite the scattered tribes not through conquest alone, but through embodiment of the divine essence that had guided Nordic civilization since its earliest days. The current manifestation exceeded even these expectations, suggesting that the prophecies themselves had been incomplete understandings of far more profound possibilities. Imperial religious authorities faced the challenge of accommodating divine manifestation within theological frameworks that had been designed to maintain clear distinctions between mortal and divine realms. The presence of an actively functioning god-emperor required extensive doctrinal revisions that preserved the essential structure of imperial religious thought, while creating space for unprecedented forms of divine presence in the material world. The administrative systems supporting the empire began operating with efficiency that transcended normal organizational capabilities as divine consciousness provided access to information and coordination methods that bypassed conventional communication limitations. Policy decisions demonstrated understanding of complex interactions between seemingly unrelated factors, suggesting analysis that encompassed variables invisible to normal observation. Economic prosperity throughout imperial territories reached levels that defied conventional explanation, as trade networks operated with supernatural coordination and resource allocation, achieved optimal efficiency through methods that appeared to involve manipulation of probability itself. Merchant guilds reported consistent success rates that exceeded statistical possibility, while agricultural yields increased despite unchanged farming techniques and environmental conditions. The military applications of divine consciousness transformed imperial forces into something approaching an unstoppable force as coordination between units achieved levels that suggested telepathic communication and strategic planning incorporated knowledge of enemy intentions before they were fully formed. Battles concluded with outcomes that favored imperial forces to degrees that enemy commanders attributed to supernatural intervention rather than superior tactics or training. The personal transformation of Tiber Septim accelerated as the merger with Zurin Arctus and Ysmir Wolfhearth approached completion. Observers noted that the emperor's physical appearance began displaying characteristics that seemed to shift depending on the viewer's perspective, as if his form was becoming somehow fluid or responsive to the expectations and needs of those who encountered him. Court artists found it increasingly difficult to create accurate portraits, as his features seemed to resist fixed representation. The emperor's behavior also evolved beyond normal human patterns as his consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that transcended individual identity. His responses to political challenges demonstrated understanding that appeared to draw upon knowledge sources existing outside normal temporal boundaries, while his emotional reactions to personal relationships became increasingly complex and multifaceted, as if multiple distinct personalities were contributing to each interaction. The strain of maintaining divine consciousness through mortal form began exacting visible costs, as Tiber Septim's physical body struggled to contain energies that exceeded its natural capacity. Court physicians reported symptoms that had no precedent in medical literature, while the emperor himself spoke of experiencing existence on multiple levels simultaneously, each requiring different types of attention and energy expenditure that competed for the limited resources of his human frame. The metaphysical architecture supporting this unprecedented transformation required constant adjustment and reinforcement through rituals that remained hidden from public observation. The emperor's daily routine incorporated practices that appeared mundane, but actually served as focal points for energies drawn from across the empire to to sustain the delicate balance between transcendence and incarnation. Even seemingly simple activities like meals and sleep involved complex magical workings that maintained the spiritual equilibrium necessary for continued divine manifestation. The approaching crisis that would test the limits of this extraordinary merger began manifesting through subtle disturbances in the fabric of reality surrounding the imperial court. Sensitive individuals reported experiencing temporal anomalies where cause and effect relationships became confused, while magical practitioners noted fluctuations in the flow of mystical energies that suggested fundamental instability in the metaphysical foundations supporting the transformation. Zurin Arctus, whose expertise had made much of the divine merger possible, began expressing concerns about the long-term sustainability of maintaining such intense spiritual unity through mortal form. His private communications with trusted associates revealed growing apprehension about consequences that might extend far beyond the immediate participants to affect the basic structure of reality throughout Tamriel and possibly beyond. The ancient powers that had been awakened by the creation and operation of the Numidium were beginning to respond to the unprecedented concentration of divine energy within mortal form. These responses manifested initially as subtle influences that enhanced the Empire's prosperity and military success, but their true nature suggested forces that operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of divine intervention in mortal affairs. The convergence of mortal ambition, magical innovation, and spiritual transcendence had created something that exceeded the intentions of any of its individual components. The figure who had begun as Tiber Septim was becoming something that challenged the fundamental categories through which consciousness understood itself and its relationship to reality. The approaching culmination of this transformation would determine whether such unprecedented unity could be sustained or whether the attempt would shatter the delicate balance that maintained stability throughout the known world. The final phase of this extraordinary metamorphosis was about to begin, carrying with it implications that would reshape not merely the political landscape of Tamriel, but the very nature of divinity itself. The mortal who had dared to reach for godhood was discovering that such ambitions carried consequences that extended far beyond personal transformation to encompass the fundamental structure of existence throughout the cosmos. The forces unleashed by this convergence began manifesting in ways that defied conventional understanding of cause and effect. Reality itself seemed to bend around the transformed consciousness of Tiber Septim, creating zones where the normal laws governing existence operated according to different principles. Courtiers reported experiencing moments where past and future became indistinguishable, while conversations with the Emperor sometimes continued discussions that had not yet begun or referenced events that existed only in potential. The Numidium's influence on these reality distortions grew increasingly pronounced as the brass god's operations synchronized with the rhythmic patterns of divine consciousness flowing through its mortal vessel. Each activation of the construct created temporal echoes that resonated through the imperial palace, establishing feedback loops between mechanical transcendence and spiritual transformation that amplified both beyond their individual capabilities. Zurin Arctus found himself caught within these expanding fields of altered reality, his consciousness stretching across multiple time streams simultaneously as he struggled to maintain coherent awareness while processing information that arrived from sources existing outside normal temporal sequence. His laboratory experiments began producing results that preceded their initiation, with magical formulae completing themselves before he had finished calculating their parameters. The Battle Mage's research notes from this period reveal a mind grappling with phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of magical practice and consciousness itself. His handwriting became increasingly erratic as he documented experiences where his individual identity seemed to dissolve into patterns of thought and perception that encompassed far more than his personal awareness could normally contain. The relationship between Arctus and the Emperor evolved beyond conventional friendship, or professional collaboration into something approaching metaphysical symbiosis. Their separate identities began merging in ways that transcended psychological bonding, creating shared consciousness that allowed each to access the other's memories, knowledge, and capabilities without the normal barriers that distinguished individual minds. This spiritual fusion accelerated as the pressures of maintaining divine consciousness through mortal form intensified. The Emperor's physical body showed increasing signs of strain as it struggled to contain energies that exceeded its natural capacity, while Arctus found his own mortality becoming fluid as exposure to divine essence began transforming his fundamental nature. The ancient spirit of Ismir Wolfhearth contributed temporal continuity that stabilized these transformations by providing access to memories and experiences that spanned centuries of Nordic history. The undead king's perspective encompassed cycles of rise and decline that offered crucial insights into the long-term patterns governing divine manifestation in mortal realms, allowing the emerging unity to avoid pitfalls that had destroyed previous attempts at transcendence. The merger of these three distinct essences created something unprecedented in Tamrielic history, a consciousness that retained individual characteristics while transcending the limitations that had constrained each separate identity. The result possessed capabilities that exceeded the sum of its components, demonstrating understanding and power that suggested access to sources of knowledge existing beyond normal temporal and spatial boundaries. The administrative efficiency of the empire reached supernatural levels, as divine consciousness provided instantaneous access to information from across vast territories. Policy decisions incorporated variables that conventional analysis could not have identified, while resource allocation achieved optimal results through methods that appeared to involve direct manipulation of probability patterns governing economic activity. Military operations conducted under divine guidance consistently achieved objectives that should have required far greater resources or more favorable circumstances. Imperial forces moved with coordination that transcended normal command structures, responding to threats before they fully materialized and exploiting enemy weaknesses that conventional observation had not yet detected. The economic prosperity spreading throughout imperial territories defied conventional explanation as trade networks operated with efficiency that suggested supernatural coordination. Merchant ventures succeeded at rates that exceeded statistical possibility, while agricultural productivity increased despite unchanged farming techniques and environmental conditions, as if the land itself was responding to divine influence. Cultural transformations accompanying imperial expansion occurred with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Conquered populations adopted imperial customs and beliefs with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the practical benefits of political submission, suggesting influence through channels that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. Local religious traditions evolved to incorporate imperial theological concepts with remarkable consistency across diverse regions, while traditional art forms began reflecting themes and symbols that originated in distant provinces. These changes occurred too rapidly and uniformly to result from normal cultural exchange, indicating coordination through mechanisms that transcended conventional communication methods. The theological implications of divine incarnation reverberated throughout every religious tradition in Tamriel as scholars and priests attempted to categorize what they were witnessing. Traditional frameworks for understanding divinity proved inadequate for describing an entity that maintained mortal form while displaying capabilities that exceeded those of established gods. Nordic shamans recognized fulfillment of ancient prophecies regarding the return of Icemir in times of greatest need, though the current manifestation exceeded even their most optimistic interpretations. Their oral traditions spoke of a figure who would unite scattered tribes through embodiment of divine essence, but the emerging reality suggested possibilities that their ancestors had barely comprehended. Imperial religious authorities faced the challenge of accommodating active divine presence within theological frameworks, designed to maintain clear distinctions between mortal and divine realms. The existence of a functioning god-emperor required extensive doctrinal revisions that preserved essential imperial religious structure, while creating space for unprecedented forms of divine manifestation. Even elven theological traditions, despite their general hostility toward human spiritual claims, acknowledged the extraordinary nature of what was occurring. Altmer scholars found themselves compelled to revise fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mortality and divinity as evidence accumulated that conventional boundaries could be transcended through means they had not previously considered possible. The metaphysical architecture supporting divine incarnation required constant maintenance through rituals that remained hidden from public observation. Imperial ceremonies that appeared to be simple state functions actually served as focal points for energies drawn from across the empire to sustain the complex spiritual equilibrium necessary for continued divine manifestation. The emperor's daily routine incorporated practices that appeared mundane, but actually involved sophisticated magical workings designed to maintain the delicate balance between transcendence and incarnation. Even seemingly routine activities like meals and sleep served as opportunities for reinforcing the metaphysical structures that allowed divine consciousness to operate through mortal form. Court life concealed elaborate magical workings that drew upon resources from every corner of the empire to support the unprecedented spiritual transformation taking place at its center. Diplomatic receptions involved carefully choreographed energy exchanges, while administrative meetings served as opportunities for reinforcing the complex spiritual bonds that held the divine merger together. The approaching culmination of this extraordinary transformation began manifesting through disturbances in the fabric of reality surrounding the imperial court. Sensitive individuals experienced temporal anomalies where cause and effect relationships became confused, while magical practitioners noted fluctuations in mystical energy flows that suggested fundamental instability in the metaphysical foundations supporting the divine merger. Zurin Arctus, whose expertise had made much of the transformation possible, began expressing private concerns about the long-term sustainability of maintaining such intense spiritual unity through mortal form. His confidential communications revealed growing apprehension about consequences that might extend far beyond the immediate participants to affect the basic structure of reality throughout Tamriel. The ancient powers awakened by the Numidium's creation and operation were beginning to respond to the unprecedented concentration of divine energy within mortal form. These responses manifested initially as beneficial influences that enhanced imperial prosperity and military success, but their true nature suggested forces operating according to principles that transcended normal understanding of divine intervention. The convergence of mortal ambition, magical innovation, and spiritual transcendence had created something that exceeded the intentions of any individual component. The figure who had begun as Tiber Septim was becoming something that challenged fundamental categories through which consciousness understood itself and its relationship to reality. The strain of maintaining divine awareness through human form intensified as the transformation approached its climactic phase. Physical symptoms appeared that had no precedent in medical literature, while psychological changes suggested consciousness expansion beyond the normal capacity of mortal minds to sustain without fundamental alteration of identity. The Emperor's appearance became increasingly fluid, seeming to shift depending on the observer's perspective and expectations. Court artists found it impossible to create accurate portraits as his features resisted fixed representation, appearing to embody multiple potential forms simultaneously rather than maintaining consistent physical characteristics. Conversations with the Emperor took on qualities that suggested communication through channels bypassing conventional speech. Crucial information seemed to pass between him and his advisors without words being spoken, while his responses to questions often addressed concerns that had not yet been fully articulated by those seeking his guidance. The boundary between individual identities became so permeable that courtiers sometimes could not determine which participant in imperial councils had initiated particular policies or decisions. The merger of consciousness had progressed to the point where conventional understanding of personal responsibility and individual agency no longer applied to the normal political processes. The Numidium's operations created cascading effects throughout the metaphysical substrate underlying Tamrielic reality, as each activation sent ripples through the fabric of existence that accumulated over time. These changes were subtle enough to escape notice by most observers, but profound enough to create new possibilities for consciousness, expansion, and reality manipulation throughout the continent. The ancient Nordic prophecies preserved in the deepest oral traditions had spoken of a time when barriers between different modes of existence would thin sufficiently to allow unprecedented forms of being to emerge. The current transformation appeared to fulfill these predictions in ways that exceeded even the most visionary interpretations, creating conditions where mortal consciousness could sustain divine awareness. The theological paradoxes created by this unprecedented merger challenged every existing framework for understanding the relationship between mortality and divinity. The emerging entity was simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizable as human, yet clearly transcending normal human limitations in ways that suggested fundamental transformation rather than mere enhancement of existing capabilities. The final phase of this extraordinary metamorphosis was gathering momentum, carrying with it implications that would reshape not merely the political landscape of Tamriel, but the very nature of divine existence itself. The boundaries between mortal and immortal, temporal and eternal, individual and universal, were dissolving in ways that would forever alter how consciousness understood its own possibilities and limitations. The approaching crisis would test whether such unprecedented unity could be sustained, or whether the attempt would shatter the delicate balance maintaining stability throughout the known world. The forces unleashed by divine incarnation were building toward a culmination that would determine the future of godhood itself, as mortal ambition reached toward heights that had never before been attempted by any conscious being in the history of creation. The crescendo of transformation reached its breaking point on a winter morning when the barriers between individual consciousness finally shattered completely. Courtiers arriving for the daily administrative meetings found themselves unable to distinguish between the emperor, his battle mage, and the ancient presence that had joined their unity. The three had become one, yet somehow remained three, existing in a state of being that defied every attempt at rational comprehension. Zurin Arctus experienced the final dissolution of his individual identity as a liberation rather than a loss. His journals, dictated to scribes during those last coherent moments, speak of consciousness expanding beyond the confines of personal memory to encompass vast repositories of knowledge that existed outside normal temporal flow. The battle mage's expertise in soul manipulation and metaphysical engineering had prepared him for transcendence, though the reality exceeded every theoretical framework he had developed. The physical strain of containing divine essence within mortal form reached its absolute limit as Tiber Septim's body began manifesting changes that suggested fundamental alteration of its basic nature. Court physicians reported symptoms that indicated the emperor's flesh was becoming something other than human tissue, transforming into a substance that could channel energies no mortal frame was designed to contain. The Numidium's final activation coincided with this climactic transformation, creating a resonance cascade that propagated throughout the metaphysical substrate underlying all of Tamrielic reality. The brass god's time-breaking capabilities synchronized with the rhythmic patterns of divine consciousness, establishing feedback loops that amplified both mechanical transcendence and spiritual transformation beyond their individual limitations. Witnesses to this culminating event described phenomena that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their understanding of existence itself. Reality became fluid around the transforming figure, with past and future colliding in the eternal present of divine awareness. The emperor's voice spoke words that had not yet been thought while responding to questions that existed only in potential, as if linear time had collapsed into a single moment containing all possibilities simultaneously. The ancient spirit of Ysmir Wulfharth provided the stabilizing influence that prevented complete dissolution into chaos. His centuries of undead existence had preserved memories spanning multiple cycles of Nordic history, offering temporal anchors that allowed the emerging divine consciousness to maintain coherence despite its expansion beyond normal boundaries of individual identity. The merger achieved completion through a process that witnesses struggled to describe using conventional language. Rather than absorption or replacement, the three essences achieved perfect harmonic resonance, creating something that retained the essential characteristics of each component, while transcending the limitations that had constrained their separate existence. The result was simultaneously 1 and 3, individual and collective, mortal and divine. The transformation's completion sent shockwaves throughout every plane of existence, as the achievement of genuine apotheosis created precedents that challenged the established order of divine hierarchy. The 8 divines, who had maintained their positions through the sacrifices made during Mundus creation, suddenly found themselves confronted by a new deity whose path to godhood had bypassed the traditional requirements of cosmic participation. Akatosh himself stirred from his timeless contemplation to acknowledge what had been accomplished, recognizing in the newly ascended Talos a reflection of his own nature as the god of time and divine kingship. The dragon god's blessing manifested as temporal stabilization that prevented the chaotic time breaks threatening to unravel reality in the wake of such unprecedented transformation. The political implications of divine ascension reverberated throughout the empire as administrators struggled to comprehend how to govern territories in the name of a ruler who had transcended mortality itself. The bureaucratic machinery of imperial government continued functioning through momentum and established procedure, but fundamental questions about authority and legitimacy required entirely new frameworks for resolution. Religious authorities across Tamriel faced the unprecedented challenge of incorporating genuine divine presence into theological systems that had been designed to maintain clear distinctions between mortal and immortal realms. The emergence of Talos forced comprehensive doctrinal revisions that preserved essential religious structures while accommodating realities that exceeded previous understanding of divine manifestation. Nordic shamans proclaimed the fulfillment of their most ancient prophecies regarding the return of Ysmir, though even their most visionary traditions had not fully comprehended the scope of what such return would entail. The god-hero of their ancestors had indeed returned, but in a form that transcended every expectation while validating the deepest truths preserved in their oral traditions. Imperial priests found themselves serving a deity who maintained direct presence rather than communicating through intermediaries or symbolic manifestations. The theological implications required fundamental reconsideration of every doctrine regarding divine accessibility and the relationship between worship and divine response. The economic and military advantages of divine governance became immediately apparent as the newly ascended Talos demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even the remarkable achievements of his mortal reign. Trade networks operated with supernatural efficiency, while military forces moved with coordination that suggested telepathic communication between units separated by vast distances. Administrative decisions incorporated understanding of complex variables that extended far beyond normal political calculation, drawing upon knowledge sources that existed outside conventional temporal boundaries. The empire's prosperity reached levels that defied economic analysis, as divine guidance optimized resource allocation through methods that appeared to involve direct manipulation of probability itself. Cultural transformation accelerated throughout imperial territories as divine presence influenced the deepest levels of collective consciousness. Local traditions evolved to incorporate imperial concepts with unprecedented speed and thoroughness, while artistic expressions began reflecting themes that originated from direct contact with divine inspiration rather than mere political influence. The metaphysical architecture supporting divine incarnation stabilized into permanent structures that drew energy from sources extending throughout the cosmos. The elaborate ritual frameworks that had been necessary during the transformation phase evolved into self-sustaining systems that maintained divine presence without requiring constant magical intervention. Yet even divine ascension carried costs that became apparent as the new god established his presence within the pantheon of Tamrielic deities. The intense focus required for maintaining simultaneous existence across multiple planes of reality meant that certain aspects of mortal concern necessarily received diminished attention, creating gaps in governance that required new institutional arrangements. The relationship between the ascended Talos and his former mortal associates created unprecedented diplomatic challenges as courtiers and administrators found themselves serving a deity whose consciousness encompassed perspectives that transcended their capacity for comprehension. Communication required development of new protocols that could bridge the gap between divine and mortal awareness. The Numidium, having served its purpose in facilitating divine transformation, was deactivated and secured within the deepest vaults of the imperial palace. The brass god's reality-altering capabilities were deemed too dangerous for routine use now that its primary objective had been achieved, though its potential for future activation remained a source of both strategic advantage and existential concern. The legacy of this unprecedented apotheosis extended far beyond the immediate political and religious consequences to establish new possibilities for consciousness development throughout Tamriel. The successful achievement of divine ascension through mortal effort demonstrated that the boundaries between different modes of existence were more permeable than previously understood. Scholars and mystics across the continent began investigating the theoretical frameworks that had made such transformation possible, seeking to understand whether similar achievements might be attainable through different methodologies. The precedent of Talos created both inspiration and caution regarding the pursuit of transcendence beyond normal mortal limitations. The theological implications reverberated through subsequent generations as religious traditions adapted to accommodate realities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divinity itself. The existence of a god who had achieved his status through mortal effort rather than cosmic participation created new categories of understanding that influenced spiritual development throughout the continent. The political structures established during Talos's mortal reign evolved to accommodate divine governance through institutional arrangements that balanced direct divine intervention with practical administrative necessity. The empire continued expanding under divine guidance, achieving objectives that exceeded the capabilities of conventional political organization, while maintaining stability through periods of transition and challenge. The cultural renaissance that accompanied divine rule produced artistic and intellectual achievements that reflected direct inspiration from transcendent sources. Literature, architecture, and magical innovation reached heights that had not been seen since the earliest days of elven civilization, demonstrating how divine influence could enhance rather than constrain creative expression. The economic prosperity spreading throughout the empire created standards of living that exceeded anything achieved by previous civilizations. Divine optimization of resource allocation and trade coordination produced abundance that seemed to emerge from careful manipulation of underlying probability patterns rather than simple productive efficiency. Military expansion under divine guidance established imperial authority throughout regions that had resisted previous conquest attempts. The combination of supernatural coordination and strategic insight derived from sources existing outside normal temporal boundaries made imperial forces effectively unstoppable, while minimizing the destruction typically associated with territorial conquest. Yet the ultimate significance of Talos's achievement lay not in its immediate practical benefits, but in its demonstration that consciousness itself possessed potentials that exceeded conventional understanding. The successful merger of mortal ambition with divine essence created precedents that would influence spiritual development throughout subsequent history. The god who had emerged from the convergence of three mortal essences established new standards for what could be accomplished through focused will and understanding of metaphysical principles. His existence proved that the boundaries between different modes of consciousness were permeable to those who possess sufficient determination and knowledge to transcend conventional limitations. The mystery of Talos thus resolves into recognition that divinity represents not a distant state achievable only through cosmic participation, but a potential inherent within consciousness itself. The man who became God demonstrated that transcendence requires not abandonment of mortality, but its complete fulfillment through perfect alignment with the deepest patterns governing existence. In the end, Talos stands as testament to the ultimate possibilities of conscious development, a figure whose achievement validates the highest aspirations of mortal ambition, while establishing divine presence as an achievable, rather than merely theoretical goal. His legacy continues inspiring those who seek to understand the true nature of consciousness and its relationship to the fundamental structures underlying all reality. The myth of Talos thus transcends simple historical narrative to become instruction in the deepest possibilities of existence itself, demonstrating that the boundaries between mortal and divine represent not absolute limitations, but challenges to be overcome through understanding, will, and the courage to pursue transcendence despite its unprecedented nature.